Hey, HRN listeners, mark your calendars for Sunday, October 13th. HRN and the National Young Farmers Coalition are teaming up for a special event at Churchtown Dairy in Hudson, New York. In honor of National Farmers Day, we'll be celebrating with local food, a screening of the documentary Common Ground, and a live panel featuring Lee Penniman of Soulfire Farm, Chris Nickel of Finca Ceremos, and more. The first 50 people to register get a free gift at the door. It's a fundraiser for young farmers and HRN supporting farmer leadership, HRN's education programs, and Farm Bill advocacy. Don't miss out. Head to support.youngfarmers.org/cgfilm to reserve your ticket today.
Westholme is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. Westholme believes that when nature leads, flavor follows. Learn more at westholme.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
This is What Doesn't Kill You, Food Industry Insights. I'm your host, Katie Kiefer, and today we have a fabulous new guest. I'm really excited to introduce this woman. Kim Arndt-Pitcher is the Director of Ecological Health at Prairie Rivers Network. Kim has worked for Prairie Rivers Network for over 14 years, and before coming to the network, she was a crew member and environmental educator at Living Lands and Waters based in Moline, Illinois. She has also worked as a technician with the USGS, that's the U.S. Geological Survey, in Kansas City, Missouri, and she has spent most of her career working to promote and advocate for the protection of biodiversity and the integrity of natural systems. The reason I invited Kim onto the show was because she was in charge of, she was the co-author of a very interesting report published by Prairie Rivers Network this past summer that talked about how herbicides drift through the air, landing on us, our water, our soil, our trees, and basically all of our plants, besides necessarily the ones that are the quote unquote target species. So Kim, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. This is a major report, in my opinion.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Let me ask you this. Are you one of the first, before we get into like what you do at Prairie Rivers, but I just want to ask, like this report, which is called Hidden in Plain Sight, is this one of the first studies on herbicide drift? Because I haven't seen any before.
Yeah, I mean, there's been publications throughout the years looking at drift on a small scale, but to our knowledge, our monitoring is the first that is, basically looking at the ecological impacts and how widespread herbicide drift is and what types of injuries it's causing to plants.
Right. It was a fascinating report. I really recommend it. We'll tell people how to access this at the end of the show. So first, let's talk a little bit about Prairie Rivers Network. They come up on my various feeds. I can't remember where I saw. I mean, I first saw this, actually, I saw the article that referenced you was in the Chicago Tribune sometime in August, I think. And that's about when I contacted you, right? And yes. So, and that might have been, I've seen Prairie Rivers Network referred to before, but not extensively. This was sort of the first major news publication that I noticed, carrying something about your work. So tell us about the network and also tell us about what you do there.
So Prairie Rivers Network is a statewide conservation organization. We're based in Champaign, Illinois. We're in our 57th year working in the state, and our mission is to protect water, heal land, and inspire change. We use the creative power of science, law, and collective action to protect and restore rivers, protect biodiversity, and try to transform how we care for the earth and for each other.
Mm-hmm. That sounds very worthy.
My role there at the organization is to lead our biodiversity and pesticide programs.
Mm-hmm. So how did you guys decide to write this report?
So back in 2017, we just started getting flooded with phone calls from landowners, land managers, people from all around the state that were noticing symptoms in their trees and plants, whether it's, in the forest that they work in or in their backyard. And they were all symptomatic of herbicide exposure. So we really were concerned about this and knew that there wasn't any monitoring. We did some investigations, and no one was currently looking at this in the state and documenting the presence or absence or the severity of any of these symptoms. And so we developed our tree and plant health monitoring program to do just that.
Uh-huh. And this monitoring program has gone on for, I'm assuming that it's ongoing, but your report was published on the basis of about 6 years of data, right?
Yeah, so we started the monitoring program in 2018, and we're still monitoring. This was our 7th year, 2024, but our report is summarizing 6 years of monitoring and tissue sampling.
Right. Oh, before we go any further, what are the symptoms, by the way, of herbicide drift? Should I be looking for that? I mean, I live not far from a number of farms, actually. Although they aren't very big. I'm in Rhode Island, just so you know.
Sure.
Farm across the street, not a lot.
Yeah, right. Well, the symptoms can vary depending on the type of herbicide that's causing the injury. What we are limited to monitoring and documenting is just what we can see, right? So a lot of these herbicides are what we call systemic. They go throughout the entire tree and plant. So there's things happening in the vascular system that we can't recognize or see. Same with the root system. Additionally, depending on what stage or type of plant it is, what stage of growth it's in, it's going to express symptoms differently. But typically what we see when we're at a location and we're looking at all different types of plants and trees across, the ground layer, understory, and canopy, we're going to see stunting in the leaves, smaller leaves, they're curled, they're cupped. Sometimes they have what we call chlorosis or yellowing in those leaves. Uh-huh. We also see branch distortion. So sometimes the branches and shoots will be elongated. We'll see branch dieback. And in many of these sites that we visit, we try to visit them multiple times throughout the growing season, or at least a couple of select sites. We visit more than once a year. But we also try to see them year after year. And what we've noticed is that in these areas where we've documented injury for multiple years, we're seeing epicormic branching and tree death. And so epicormic branching is sort of like a tree's last ditch effort to produce leaves that can make its food. And they start coming out the main branches and the trunks, and the canopy looks really, really thin. These trees are clearly very sick.
Wow. That makes me really sad to hear. I love trees. If I could have an arboretum, that would be my favorite form of garden. So
yeah.
So tell us about some of the more, as I described it, eye-popping findings, because they really were quite. I mean, you surveyed. Tell us how many sites. What kinds of, we just talked about the kinds of plant injuries you saw. What about the distances? Like how far away from, say, I mean, you in Southern Illinois, that's a really big corn and soy area. So there's a lot of chemicals, agrochem going into the soil and onto the plants. How far does it go away from its, where it's supposed to be?
Yeah. So we looked at 280 individual sites. And about 143 of those we tried to visit every single year. And what we saw was there was injury at those sites year after year. We also took a lot of tissue samples, and more than 90% of the tissue samples that we collected and had analyzed at a reputable lab had detectable levels of herbicide in them. And so we're taking these samples blind, right? We don't know when exposure has happened. We just know these plants have symptoms. And so 90% of them had those residues present in them at the time of analysis. And 6 of those sample locations are more than a mile away from any potential source. And so when we say source, we're looking at crop fields, pastures, golf courses, anywhere where herbicides might be used in a large scale. So they're traveling far. And really, our data shows that symptoms are extremely widespread. And many of our sites that we look at multiple times a growing season are showing, up to 15 exposures a year.
Wow.
Or not a year, 15 exposures over the 6-year period.
I see. So at least twice a year, basically.
At least.
And sometimes 3. And that would correspond with, how farmers I mean, yeah, I mean, let's talk about farmers in particular, but we can talk about like golf courses and parks and stuff like that. But you're spraying at the beginning of the season, in the middle of the season, and probably one other time if you're trying to control weeds. And of course, you have to keep controlling for more and more weeds that are herbicide resistant. And so that brings me to the next question, which is, what are the chemicals that we're talking about primarily?
So, when this first came on our radar, it was when dicamba-resistant soybeans and cotton came out on the market. And, there were a ton of complaints out there throughout the Midwest of injuries to non-resistant soybean fields from herbicides. And that's kind of how it made the headlines for a long time. But then people started really noticing injuries to trees and orchards, and apiaries were collapsing. And we were like, wow, this is a huge problem. And so we started looking at the data that's collected by the U.S. Geological Survey. And they, have this program where they are measuring the amounts or collecting information, survey data on the amounts of different pesticides that are used on the landscape and agricultural lands. And there was an increase throughout this time in 2,4-D, atrazine, glufosinate, and several other widely used herbicides that kind of corresponded with this increase in dicamba. And so we started testing for those because some of those symptoms are similar to what dicamba and 2,4-D are found in lawn care. They're found in turf management. They're also widely used in agriculture. Their symptoms are very similar. They're growth regulator herbicides. That's that curling, that cupping that you're going to see. Atrazine is one of the most widely used herbicides in corn production. So we started testing for those, and we're finding them widespread. And so are other researchers that have started doing tissue analysis in the past couple of years as well.
Wow. So you saw this, like you're saying this started about 6 or 7 years ago. I'm trying to think, like, when did I'm trying to extrapolate, like, glyphosate, which of course I've been doing this show for 15 years. So
yeah.
I remember talking with what's his name? I think it's Benson, who was the first one to talk about how glyphosate, glyphosate was becoming a problem because herbs were becoming resistant to it, even though we, of course, carefully engineered our 5 or 6 of our major crops to withstand glyphosate. And that's when dicamba and 2,4-D started to reemerge as the herbicides of choice. And I guess
correct.
Yeah, so that had to be about 7 to 10 years ago, I think, that we started seeing those stories. Charles Benbrook, that's
Charles
the guy.
Benbrook, yeah. We've been having drift issues since we started using herbicides, right? But it's the uptick in the widespread use of these growth regulators that are really volatile, like 2,4-D and dicamba, that will leave the field even days after they've applied, that essentially evaporate into the atmosphere and move long distances, that we were like, whoa, this is a whole new set of problems. And there are researchers in the past year here in Illinois that have done some data collection and monitoring, and they've sampled for a wide range of pesticides. They're at the Natural History Survey here in Illinois, and they found fungicides and insecticides also. It's just that we happen to see these visible symptoms occurring once we started using more 2,4-D and dicamba. And then it's kind of opened this world of problems associated with the way we're using pesticides.
Well, that begs the question then, like the other ones which don't drift quite the same way. I mean, insecticides and pesticides or whatever, they are not potentially drifting in the same way, but they are probably having a significant impact. Or are they drifting the same way? And we're just not seeing it because it's in the insect world or it's in the fish population.
And that's a great question. And that's one a lot of us are asking, is how far are these other ones moving? And how much of this is, a product of the changes in how we're farming? We've got bigger machinery. We have, climate's changing. We have, different windows of opportunity to legally apply these herbicides. We have fewer fence rows and wind blocks. It's super complex, but
Yes.
I think that we have to recognize that there are things that we're seeing, and we need to investigate what those mean for us, but then also look deeper into, okay, we know there's other pesticides out there having impacts. What are they, and what are those symptoms, and what are the implications for environmental health and for human health?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's the implications are very very dire and very broad. I mean, it's hard to imagine that any life, if you're applying a substance which is designed to kill something, chances are it's going to kill something else too, right? I mean, isn't that science?
Yeah, and I think it's important, to realize that we've never been where we are in the history of agriculture.
Right.
Right? I mean, we're applying these herbicides throughout the growing season and these pesticides on a mass scale throughout the growing season. And at the same time, many of our states, including Illinois, are, at some of the lowest levels of our, ecological monitoring and environmental monitoring that we've ever been at.
Really?
And so, I mean, I think over the years, we have ecological monitoring programs, but they've suffered cuts in our Department of Natural Resources and state environmental protection agencies. They're often not funded enough to do the types of monitoring that are required. And if without that data, it's really difficult to enforce laws and regulations.
Right. And that's why an organization like yours is so important, because you're picking up the slack on doing that work. The problem is that then the information that you have gathered, there's no actionable, strategy after you've given that data over to these to these organizations that are supposed to be regulating it. But let's talk for a second about the regulations. Like, what is the role of the EPA in this, for example? What laws are used to regulate the use of agrochemicals? You mentioned, for example, that there are specific times of the year when they're allowed to apply them, right? They're not allowed to just apply this stuff willy-nilly whenever they feel like it or whenever they see a weed, right?
Yeah, so there's a couple major pieces of federal legislation that regulate and oversee pesticides. And the first one is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA. And that's designed to address registration, sale, distribution, use, disposal, et cetera. We also have the Food Quality Protection Act, which contains regulations, I'm sure you're very familiar with it, that were designed to improve the safety associated with human exposure to pesticides. And then each state in FIFRA is given the authority or the mandate really to have their own regulatory guidelines. And for Illinois, it's the Illinois Pesticide Act. And the government entity that is responsible for that is our Department of Agriculture. And then, of course, across the whole U.S., the label on these pesticides is the law. So that's where that window of opportunity for application comes into play. Each label has guidelines that make it that tell the user how they can and when they can and where they can and can't apply that pesticide. And that is the law. And that's, there's hundreds of labels out there. Right.
And those are produced by either the Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or the EPA, I would imagine.
Yes.
Or I suppose the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, should have some. These are food plants that they're being sprayed on, right?
Right. And that's another aspect of it is, consumer levels of food, pesticides in the food.
And, that makes me wonder also, like, when was the last time? I mean, first of all, since some of these pesticides have been around for a while, but have they, the way we are discovering that PFAS, for example, the levels that we said were safe turned out to be, way too lax. I mean, in other words, it wasn't really, we weren't really supposed to have 20 parts per trillion. You really should only have about 4 parts per trillion, right? But it took until just now to discover that was really a much more appropriate number for what was allowable in human consumption. And I suspect, and you should correct me, but I would bet that there have not been any very recent trials on what are safe and not safe levels in human tissue.
I mean, for the new registrations, they have to perform some new trials to determine the safety of that. But again, we're talking about the synergistic possibilities here between lots of different pesticides being airborne and utilized throughout the growing season. So it's not just one, right? We're not in a laboratory with a perfectly controlled dose here. So there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to environmental impacts. And plus, when we're looking at the testing and the safety of a lot of these, I mean, honeybees are the go-to invertebrate for insects. And they're not even a native insect, right? They don't consume plant tissue. They consume pollen and they take nectar, but they don't behave like the majority of other insects out there, even our wild bees. So I think that there's a lot of improvements that we could make in order to make sure that we are really testing these products appropriately and thoroughly.
And also you just alluded to something that I hadn't even thought of, but as you said, it's not just one. It's not a laboratory situation where you test one on a certain type of thing and observe the results over multiple generations of mice or bees or whatever. It's the possible synergy of 3, 4, 5, 6 of these chemicals coming together, creating a unique compound for which we have no testing.
Well,
would that be fair to say?
I wouldn't necessarily say it would be a unique compound, but I would say that it's a unique set of stressors. So it's like, me, if I've been really stressed at work and I just got over a cold, but then I get exposed to the flu, I'm more likely to get sick, right? Really sick than if I hadn't had those previous stressors. And, plants, we're learning, are the same way. And so is wildlife. And so are our pets and us. So it's a cumulative thing, and it's cumulative things that we understand very poorly, and that's the concerning part of it.
Most definitely, Kim. We're going to take a short break, and we're going to come back. I want to talk a little bit more about sort of what, if any, measurable or observable impacts have been on human health, wildlife, insects, etc. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with Kim Ernst-Pitcher.
Whether you're a chef or just love going to restaurants, you know the best ingredients are everything, especially when it comes to beef. In Northern Australia, there's a different approach to raising high-quality beef. Westholme, based in Queensland and Northern Territory, is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. Westholme stewards 16 million acres of rangeland guided by their natural ecosystem. They're led by a belief that if they balance the needs of their cattle with the needs of the environment, both can thrive. Westholme's team of rangeland experts and nature managers use a variety of tools to monitor and respond to the welfare of the environment, like satellites that assess grass health and on-the-ground research. Cattle are happier when they have the freedom to forage and explore, so Westholme ensures that they can roam wild, foraging at will for the first 2 to 3 years of their lives. Their cows graze on native grasses like Mitchell grass, which is only found in Australia, along with dozens of other plants, herbs, and seasonal legumes. The result is a high-quality Wagyu beef that reflects the terroir of Northern Australia and a flavor suited to complement any cuisine. Westholme believes that when nature leads, flavor follows. Learn more at westholme.com.
Okay, so let's go forward with that discussion of the impacts on wildlife, on water, on aquatic life, on people. I mean, one of the things that was brought up in the Chicago Tribune article and also in the sort of précis of your report that's on your website is that, many people have become very alerted to this because, say, there are fields that are quite close to school or, a place where people are recreating. and you don't want your children, especially, or pregnant women, especially, to be exposed to these chemicals at any level. And so, talk a little bit about what has been observed in the case of, say, human health, for example, and then we'll move on to some other species.
Sure. So the aspect of human health is kind of out of the scope of what we looked at, but we've been kind of careful to avoid acting like experts on that because we really aren't. But I can tell you that it is a question we receive every time we talk to people. When we go to people's property to monitor and we show them what these symptoms are that they, have probably been receiving for years and would never recognize it. They're like, well, what does this mean for me? I'm out here, my children are out here.
Right.
And that is an answer we'd really love to have. That is a question we really love to have answers to. There are more and more studies coming out that show pesticides have impacts on fetal and childhood development and overall health. Mm-hmm. We also have quite a bit of data on the health concerns for farm workers and their families who have historically.
Thank you. That was my next question.
Yeah, they've historically had greater exposures to these chemicals, and then they bring those things home, right, on their shoes and on their clothes.
Right.
And they often live in close proximity to these fields as well. So there is a growing amount of evidence on that as well.
Fascinating.
In terms of, wildlife impacts, again, it's this chronic stress that we're seeing. Right. And that's in addition to flooding and diseases and pest pressures and even invasive species. So while we may be out monitoring, we may see symptoms, on 20 different species of plants at a site, but we're also seeing, other stressors in these ecosystems as well. And when it comes to 2,4-D or dicamba, we know those growth regulator herbicides, we know that they can cause plants to produce fewer flowers. There's changes in the quality and quantity of nectar and pollen. They can produce fewer nuts, seeds, and fruit, and that the nutritional content of those plants, and you got to remember, many insects and animals are herbivores, right? And that nutritional content can be reduced as well. So that can lead to some really serious and complex ecosystem level impacts that we really don't understand. I know that, there's several studies now that have looked at caterpillars that have eaten leaf tissue that has been contaminated with herbicides, particularly 2,4-D and dicamba or atrazine. And those caterpillars are smaller, they have a reduced size, and that could have huge impacts for migratory birds, if you think about it, because that's the primary food that they feed their young. And they feed their young hundreds of these caterpillars every year. And those caterpillars drop into the streams and our fish eat them. But if they're smaller, or if they have lower nutritional content, that means that those parents have to work harder to feed those young. And so there's all these things that we're not really looking at that to people like myself and my partners we're deeply concerned about.
Obviously, this is not unique to Illinois. So are you aware of other organizations that are in other states that are pursuing similar research? In other words, are they taking a page out of your book and like in, say, Iowa or Wisconsin or, Indiana, other Kentucky, wherever they grow corn and soy in large quantities as they do where you are you seeing other states follow your lead in this?
Yeah. So, when this started happening, we started reaching out to other states and saying, are you seeing this here? What's going on there? And there are some researchers that there's small groups in Missouri and the Dakotas and Arkansas that have been doing some tissue analysis and a little bit of monitoring. I know Missouri is starting to look at impacts to insects in forest communities. But, I think Illinois is further ahead in our monitoring and our data because we have, what we have at PRN plus the Natural History Survey. And we've worked really closely with our Department of Natural Resources and heritage biologists to monitor, our high quality natural areas in the state and help monitor and document and collect samples from those locations as well.
Right. So I read in your report that current regulations in Illinois do not serve to protect plants or people, air or water from chemical drift. Like at least that was my takeaway from your report, that there aren't really any especially stringent regulations in Illinois to govern this kind of herbicide drift. Is it safe to say that other states are equally failing in the regulatory space there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that many states are in the same boat because of the weaknesses with the federal regulations around pesticides. And then, many of the states are also struggling with funding. And, we have an enforcement program here in Illinois for pesticide misuse, but that is based on people complaining that they have injury. And in order to do that, you have to be able to recognize that you have injury. Most people don't know they have injury.
Right.
You also have to be willing to implicate a neighbor of improperly using a herbicide. And then that is a huge hurdle socially for people to implicate a neighbor of wrongdoing. And, they don't have the staff largely to, if we were to have this flood of misuse complaints throughout the state, they don't have the staff to properly enforce it. So, I could talk for days about the problems associated with, this issue in our state, but we're not alone. Lots of states are having these same problems.
Sure. I mean, any state that has any kind of farming going on is going to have this very same problem. I mean, these chemicals are ubiquitous throughout our agricultural model in the United States. Mm-hmm. Kim, what do you think? I mean, let's be honest here. The reason that these departments are underfunded and there isn't enough research going on, et cetera, is because there are people who don't want that.
Yeah.
There are vested interests who are actively, seeking to sway legislators and reduce funding towards those ends of keeping our air, water, soil, and populations safe. Because we place profit over people on the regular basis here in this country. And so but in a perfect world, say, what would be a better way of enforcing this? It's not just that we don't have enough studies, it's that we don't have a way to really monitor this in any meaningful way, do we?
Well, I mean, we do. We know how to do it. We don't have the funding to do it. And I think, the monitoring is really important, but this is a system level problem. And we really, it's very complex. We're dealing with a deeply incentivized agricultural system and industry, chemical industry, and they're deeply highly subsidized by taxpayer dollars. And, it's very complex, but I think, there's a long game and then there's a short game, and the short game is sort of what I'm most concerned about right now. And that is stopping the level of drift that we have right now, because we're seeing decline. We're seeing, orchards and vineyards go out of business because they can't handle the financial cuts that they're taking from drift year after year. We are seeing serious threats to our ecosystems that we are not fully understanding. And we need regulatory action that is going to buy us time. And I don't have the answers for exactly what that looks like. I have ideas, but it's going to vary state by state, I think, to some degree. And then we have that long game of we have to diversify our agricultural system. We have to produce food and fiber in a way that doesn't harm others. This is chemical trespass, without a question. It is harming and causing financial distress to citizens all over the Midwest and South. Mm-hmm. And, we need to give our growers the technical assistance and the markets and the support they need to get off this chemical treadmill. Because the only ones profiting really are the chemical industries and the seed. So, our farmers
preach it, sister.
our farmers are stuck in this system, and the winners are industry, and we need to change that.
Yeah, because let's acknowledge the fact that most, especially in your area, where I am in Rhode Island and New England, Middle Atlantic states, you've got smaller farms, so you're not farming 10,000 acres of soybeans. And that's where you're seeing, the biggest applications of these herbicides, right? I mean, I guess maybe where there's a lot of golf courses, you would see a lot of that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of there's an addiction to the green lawn as well out there,
Oh
but
my
the
God, no
majority
kidding.
the majority of it is coming from agricultural production, and the majority of that is commodity crops and pastures.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. So, I mean, it really is going to take a full on shift away from farming in that way. And as you said, to diversify your crops, for example. What are some of the other strategies? I mean, I'm sort of burning out on, oh, well, if we just plant cover crops, if we just, do crop rotations, everything's going to be fine. I don't really think that's right. But you're much better informed than I am. So what do you think is the answer?
I don't know. You're pretty informed. I think it's part of the solution, right? I mean, cover crops aren't going to work for everybody, and a lot of people burn them down with herbicides, so that's not really like the silver bullet.
Right.
So, it is going to take regulation. Everybody hates that word, but
yes,
we are using these chemicals on tens of millions of acres of land, and we have got to have more regulations on their use and better enforcement. And again, I go back to who has the right. It's do I have the right to have a vegetable garden in my backyard, or
right,
preserve bottomland forests for my great grandchildren to enjoy? Because
right.
there are people that are trying to do that and they're being destroyed, and that's not fair. Communities are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars every year, millions of dollars even in some places, to remove atrazine from their drinking water resources. So there has to be sort of like a checks and balances in this system, and we just don't have it.
You would think so. I mean, I do a lot of programming around water pollution in the Midwest states. Particularly in Iowa. I have a great reporter up in the Michigan area who's done a lot of work on what's going on in Iowa. And then I'm sure you've heard of this guy Chris Jones, who was yeah, right. So, and Chris has been on the show a bunch of times, and I mean, it seems that the right to have no chemical trespass, as you call it. I think it's an excellent phrase, because that implies it's not just, drifting through the air. It's in your water source as well. As you just said, people are spending millions of dollars taking atrazine out of their water. And I'm sure these other chemicals are just as implicated in that water pollution problem as the one you mentioned, and the ones that Keith talks about, all of the nitrates and phosphorus that come in from primarily from fertilizers. I mean, I don't know what it will take to wake people up to the fact that they are getting sold, to use the yet another metaphor, sold down the river literally by governments, state governments that refuse to push back on these, large agrichem companies and big agricultural concerns. I mean, these are not small town farmers with a few hundred acres. These are major corporations, often owned by hedge funds and venture capitalists, right? I mean, TIAA-CREF, a huge landowner. I mean, they're spraying that stuff all over the place, and then they're delivering pension funds to the people who invest, with nobody understanding that there is a loop here. It's anyway.
Yeah.
I go on. I'm sorry. This is one of the problems with being on the show with me, is I digress horribly. So, so let's talk a little bit about when you were talking about regulatory frameworks and better monitoring. Where does the EPA, again, an underfunded institution, where does the EPA stand on this? Like what kind of measures can they take, or can they advocate for?
Yeah, so I think they are, in recent years, trying to do a better job of catching up to establishing good protections for threatened and endangered species and species of concern. And but I think that there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of pesticide approval and regulation, in terms of the research and data that they use for those processes. as well as their approval for these new genetically modified, resistant crops that are sort of the whole root of this herbicide treadmill that we're all on in the country.
Right.
And I think, so they are trying to do some stuff, but there's a lot that needs to be done. I think one of the really big things that needs to be addressed urgently is the issue of vapor drift. And when these chemicals volatilize and move up in the atmosphere and can travel sometimes for miles and land off and land and cause injury at a landscape scale, that is a tremendous problem. And they need to address that. And I think there's some options for the states to also work to address that as well. And I know Illinois has taken some steps to address the volatility of dicamba by having, date cutoffs and temperature restrictions, but it's not doing a lot of good.
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, agriculture, as many of my listeners know, is basically the only unregulated industry that we have in the United States. Every other industry, there are rules about what their emissions can and cannot be. And with agriculture, and this is very true of the meat industry, which I happen to be most familiar with, because they too, like at a feedlot, in a concentrated animal feeding operation, the particulate matter from dried up manure, for example, can go up into the sky and travel not just a few miles, but literally thousands of miles. I mean, they have tracked particulate matter from CAFOs in Texas all the way to Africa. And it's hard to imagine that the herbicide, volatilized agrichem, such as you're describing, are not following a very similar trajectory. They get lofted up into the jet stream and boom, they're in another country that has never used an herbicide potentially, right? It's like, what the hell just happened?
Right. Well, I mean, and if you think about it, we get smoke from wildfires.
Absolutely.
Halfway across the country.
I mean, it's not static. This stuff is not static. And that's really where that is the rub, I think, ultimately, is that how do you control the air? And, I just don't think there's much of an answer for that.
Yeah. I don't think we can, but I think that, what we're trying to do is build awareness, highlight these concerns and the injuries that we're seeing, and build a coalition of ecologists, researchers, landowners, other NGOs that care about this issue, that can help elevate it and apply pressure, against this machine that we're facing. And that's just, the industrialized system that is kind of robbing us of our environmental health.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, I say that sort of glibly, but it's like, I don't really know. I don't have an answer for how you dismantle the industrial agriculture machine, because the fact is we have a big population.
Yeah.
We need to grow a lot of food. Now, we don't need to feed the world, as they like to tell us, but, we need some food.
We do need food, but that is part of it, right?
See us going.
We need our orchards. We need our vegetable farms, our tomato farms, and we can't be hurting them.
Yeah, right. We can't be killing that goose that lays the golden egg. Boy, I'm really big on the metaphors today. I'm sorry. It's like very sloppy thinking on my part. But, they serve a purpose. But that is the problem. It's like industrialized agriculture is, in my opinion, not going to go away. And so the challenge becomes, how do we make it a more holistic operation that builds on the successes and tries to address some of these major failures. And I don't see a lot of political will pushing in that direction. Although there was a big piece in the New York Times today about, the Biden and Harris administration going after some of the big, the big meat monopolies, especially the chicken industry. Who knows what will happen if Harris gets elected? Then we might see more of that. But I think it's a scary proposition for any of these politicians to go up against these very well-funded, very powerful organizations, right?
Well, it is, and I think it's intimidating for a lot of us that are doing this work. But I also think that we are spending millions and millions of dollars to green our communities and build resilience and use green infrastructure and natural solutions to reduce flooding and to keep our communities cool from, these heat waves. And that involves, trees and prairies and protection of some of these natural areas. And we need to protect that. So there is an economical argument there that I think we can use to, bolster
This
our
sort of
opinion on this. Yeah.
Right. Because otherwise, business people will dismiss this as, it's the earthy crunchies, gassing on about the poor birds and bees. Well, yeah, they actually play a role, right? I mean,
It's a pretty important role, yes.
Right.
As much as we try to divorce ourselves from nature, it is impossible. So
it actually does have meaning. Kim, we are in our last moment here, so I'm going to give you an opportunity. Tell people where they can find this excellent report. I highly recommend it, people, called Hidden in Plain Sight. So tell us all about PRN and your work and how people can learn more and support you.
They can visit our website at prairierivers.org and find our report, Hidden in Plain Sight, Herbicide Drift and Chemical Trespass, on our website. And feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is also there. And, donate and support our work. We value everything.
So Kim, thank you very, very much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been great talking with you.
I'm really glad you enjoyed it. And you scared the daylights out of me. I don't know. Yeah. I'm never going to leave my house again. That's all I can say.
We've got to have hope.
That's right. We got to have hope. So until then, folks, until next time, I wish you all the best. Thanks to my sponsors, as always, for supporting this radio station. And thanks to you listeners for tuning in. See you on the next round. So long for now.
What Doesn't Kill You, Food Industry Insights, is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.